Good afternoon, everyone. I apologize for the delay in getting started. We had some technical issues that we were working through, but thank you for joining today. My name is Nathan Davis. Pleased to welcome you to our first or second event of the year for the LGBTQ and Planning Division. So we are celebrating Transgender Awareness Week with the division and Dr. Petra Doan. So I just want to go over a few quick slides and then we'll turn it over to Dr. Doan to give a brief lecture. Followed by that, we have some moderated Q&A, and then we also have some time for audience Q&A. So during the webinar, throughout the entire thing, you're welcome to drop any comments, questions that you may have in the chat. Let's see, let me make sure that's actually, yep. So it looks like the chat is working. Is there a echo? That's what I apologize for that. There shouldn't be. So let's see here. So you're welcome to drop any questions that you may have in the chat during it, and then we will get to those at the end. So just a brief introduction to who we are. We are the LGBTQ and Planning Division of the American Planning Association. So we represent all members of the LGBTQ community and allies as well. And if anybody is interested in joining, we always welcome new members. Some of you may have received notice of this webinar through our mailing list. Others may have received it through um, through the First Friday notes. So I see that there was one comment that says chat is turned off and only Q&A is available. So just please submit any questions that you have through the Q&A. So I know many of you are striving towards your AICP credits. So this is registered with AICP with the APA. So it is eligible for one CM credit and one equity CM credit. And this is the APA ID number that you'll type in to find that event and get your credit for it. So just a brief bit about Trans Awareness Week and why we're celebrating it. So it's observed every year from November 13th through 19th. So yesterday was the first day of the week. It's not a calendar week. And then it'll go through middle of next week. But it's a time to honor the experiences, resilience, and contributions of transgender and gender nonconforming people. The week raises visibility around the challenges trans communities face while also celebrating their leadership, creativity, and role in shaping more inclusive cities and neighborhoods. This webinar is part of that effort, offering planners an opportunity to deepen their understanding of how land use regulations, zoning, and everyday planning decisions affect trans safety, belonging, and access to space. And then finally, we have I'll turn it over to Dr. Doan to introduce herself, but we are very pleased to have her today to give this lecture. And Dr. Doan?
Okay. Yes, thank you. So I began my career a long time ago as a Peace Corps volunteer. I worked in West Africa in actually rural development. And then I went off to grad school at Cornell in city and regional planning, where I studied international development planning in Africa and the Middle East. I joined the faculty at FSU in 1989. I taught there until 2022 when they changed the bathroom laws, making it no longer possible for me to be on campus and use the correct restroom. So I retired with Emerita status and have been living in the state of Maine since that time. And it's a great pleasure to be here with you. And I've obviously been active in the community since I transitioned in 1998. I've been publishing 3 books and lots of articles on planning in LGBTQ spaces. And I'll be drawing on some of that material today when I talk with you all. Um, we're still having just a little bit of programming issues. Um, I guess I want to talk about just I'll add a word on trans awareness and this Trans Awareness Week. When it started 15, 20 years ago, Trans Awareness was a single, Trans Day of Remembrance was a single day commemorating the trans folks who'd been killed. I got an email today from the National Trans Lobby Group, and indeed 17 people have been murdered this year, most of them women of color, trans women of color. And that will be next week that we'll be celebrating that. And that's a sad day. I think there's an additional number of people who have committed suicide, but those suicides are more difficult um, to count because one never is quite sure why, what happens. Um,
Dr. Doan, I apologize for the delay. I'm just, when I opened it up, there were some formatting errors, so I'm correcting those now so that we can get that.
okay.
All right.
I did have some animations in there, some timings, and that
Okay.
may be what's screwing up. Sometimes different versions of PowerPoint don't act well. We'll
Okay.
we'll, we'll deal with that.
Okay.
I can cover it on the fly.
Just let me know when I switch slides and I'm happy to.
Sure. It's probably going to be just a mouse click. When I do it myself, anyway, we'll let you know. Okay.
Yeah.
I'll just say click, I think.
Okay. Are you able to see it?
No,
The structure of the presentation?
not yet.
Oh gosh. Oh, I think it stopped. I apologize everybody for the technical difficulties here. Okay. Here we go.
That's got it. Okay, so I'd like to talk today about the impacts of municipal zoning, land use, and local regulations. Caveat, I am not primarily a land use planner, and zoning was something I avoided to the maximum extent possible until I really saw the relevance to the preserving queer spaces. So I've titled this "The Struggle to Preserve Queer Spaces." Go ahead and click, Nathan. And so the structure of the presentation is I want to talk briefly about the urgency of resistance from planners. I want to talk about sort of the fluidity of queer spaces. I want to talk about the negative impacts on queer spaces, particularly in zoning for housing, zoning that bans adult enterprises, fast track development that's often used as a tool to keep neighborhoods from sort of protesting zoning changes, targeted enforcements of licensing, noise, nuisance, loitering, sex work that often have an impact in LGBTQ areas. And then I want to talk briefly about solutions and tools for preserving queer neighborhoods. Next. So I want to talk about the urgency of now. I started Cornell in 1981 as a master's student in regional planning, and there was a T-shirt that a lot of the students in the classes above us had, which said, "Planners equal gorillas in the bureaucracy." And I loved that T-shirt. I never was able to get one because everybody held on to it. Um, and 40 years later, I think the role of planners as gorillas in the bureaucracy is more urgent than ever. I'm not talking revolution, but I am talking resistance. So we are facing what I would consider to be explicit political erasure right now. A great example is the way that the current administration has decreed that any paintings on the roadscape are unsafe, and they're using that as an example. I'm sure you all are aware of this, to ban rainbow crosswalks and other crosswalks that are pertaining to particular groups. And but there's also been a lot of community resistance, particularly I'm no longer in Florida, but outside the Pulse nightclub where that terrible massacre happened 5 or 6 years ago. There was a rainbow crosswalk, and every time they painted over, local residents come and repaint the rainbow. Sometimes they put, markers on their feet to sort of paint the rainbow as they sort of slide across. So there's a lot of community resistance, but there's also been, they put state troopers and they arrest people who do that. So there's a struggle going on. The LGBTQ National Historic Preservation Report by the National Task Force on LGBTQ issues that was convened under the Obama administration. We did a report on the importance of preserving LGBTQ spaces, and that has been taken down from the Department of Interior website. There are still fugitive copies around. If you're particularly interested in that, I can try to trace one down for you. Transgender has been completely erased from the signage for the Stonewall, the landmark national designation. So it's not on the website, it's not on the actual signage itself. How do we respond to this erasure? And then I guess I want to ask a couple of questions that are similar to that, but can truly queer spaces survive, and did they ever exist? Next slide. So I want to talk briefly about queer spaces and what they are. They began mostly in underinvested neighborhoods. LGBTQ people were not welcome elsewhere. But at some point, fairly early on, there was this sort of shift, and it became an exercise in building capital through sweat equity rehabbing of buildings. And then as those buildings became finished, they were flipped. And that seems to have been one element in the gentrification that has caused obviously some gay men to have done very well and others to not do well. If you were invested in the underinvestment time, you were fine. If you tried to move into queer space anytime within the last 20 years for most of the big queer spaces, you can't afford to move in there. And that led to a lot of businesses thriving, coffee shops, bookstores. The revitalized neighborhood attracted lots of buyers, and the neighborhood transitioned. And, I grew up in and around Philadelphia, and I used to love to go into the Philly neighborhood, just sort of checking things out. And when I went there, I don't know, about 15 years ago, we had an LGBT, we had the National Planning Conference there for the Association of Collegiate Schools of Planning. And I saw a lot of straight couples pushing baby carriages walking through the heart of the neighborhood. Something had changed. One of the factors that's made that change, and I think we just need to note this, is that HIV/AIDS had a tremendous impact on those queer spaces that developed in the 70s and 80s and 90s, because between 1987 and 1998, over 300,000 people died as a result of this plague. And of course, most of those people were living in dense urban concentrations like queer spaces. And so that opened up lots of property that speculators were able to buy. So it isn't just on ourselves that we did it to ourselves. Next slide, please. So I think it's important to critique the development of queer spaces. We're a couple slides back, Nathan. We need to go forward. That's it. Nope, one before that. That's it. So I want to critique the inclusivity of queer spaces. You can keep flicking, because I think a lot of people have written about whether queer spaces are really ever queer, or were they. They're mostly full of white gay men. Some people have called them commodified zones for tourism. Others have said, they're basically places for wealthy gay men. Lesbians tend to be absent from these spaces. Sometimes they pass through them for a lesbian night at one of the bars. Cy Adler, a planning professor at Portland State, and Joanna Brenner wrote an article saying it's because women have lower incomes and tend to have more kids, and that changes their housing choice, so they're not wanting to locate in downtown areas. And the other differences are also at least welcome with a question mark. Bisexuals have not typically been terribly warmly welcomed in queer spaces. Um, I wrote an article almost 20 years ago about whether trans people were actually welcome. Were sort of tolerated, but not completely welcome. And kind of Vivian Namaste wrote about trans invisibility in queer spaces. So they're not really inclusive in terms of race and ethnicity or in terms of other identity positions, subject positions. Next slide. So typically, I think we need to be also straight up about planning itself. Planning itself can have has been used, planning as a tool. It's just a tool. We as a planning community aren't necessarily culpable for all of it, but planning has been used to help create what Bill Goldsmith and Ed Blakely called a separate but unequal society. Martha Ritzdorf argued that zoning codes have pathologized the African American family. We'll come back a little to that sort of family discussion. One of the ways that planning has been particularly implicated, particularly in the 60s, late 50s, early 60s, was the whole urban redevelopment, which divided often low-income areas or outright destroyed them and made them basically unlivable. Next slide, please. June Manning Thomas has written wonderfully about the importance of race in planning. And what she says is that city improvement in the face of racial oppression is racially oppression. That is, if you're making investments to change the city in a context of racial oppression, then whatever happens will also be racially oppressive. I think we need to think about this for LGBTQ areas because planning in the context of LGBT phobia, whether it's homophobia, whether it's transphobia, is also going to be homophobic or transphobic unless we are conscious and aware of what's going on. And Forsyth talks about a number of negative planning implications, some of which I'll draw on here. Michael Frisch talked about city planning as a heterosexist project. So I don't think this is something that we cannot cure ourselves of, but we have to change awareness to think about what these impacts might be. The planning profession needs to understand how do the small policy changes that we're tweaking, how can those have tremendous impacts? Next slide, please. And that's what we'll talk about today. So I want to talk initially about zoning impacts on affordable housing. So single-family residential R1 may limit the number of unrelated people living in one household. Sometimes it is for other residential zones as well, depending on your local codes. But often they depend on the definition of a family. It's sort of one of the building blocks of sort of residential zoning. But what is a what is a family? Is it only a traditional family? What about non-traditional family arrangements? What about a bunch of lesbians living together, as happened in Atlanta with the Atlanta Lesbian Feminist Alliance that in the 1970s had 3 or 4 group homes in Candler Park, an area on the outskirts of Atlanta at the end of what had been the old streetcar line. And that enabled a lot of young lesbians to come into this Candler Park, which was an area under a less expensive area, but still they didn't have the money to live in to buy these houses, so they lived in group homes, and that was able to create some of that feminist consciousness raising that I think was very important in creating an identity. Some of which the pictures are too small for you to see, but the one picture says. Growing a lesbian feminist network, and the picture at the bottom on the right is the the Atlanta Lesbian Feminist Alliance softball team, which was a very important organizing tool. But other traditional family arrangements might be also affected. In communities that I move right now, it's not my community, but I'm very aware of people who identify as polyamorous. And what happens when you have poly families that are sort of growing and triples and more potentially? What happens if you have simply three or four gay men sharing a house because it's too expensive otherwise? These zoning codes could ban that. One of the other things that happens with affordable housing is upzoning. And again, we saw this very much so in my work in Atlanta, so that if you upzone your residential areas, it may ease a conversion from apartments to condos. Now, some of this might be actually useful in terms of increasing the density of the urban landscape, and that may have beneficial impacts for things like public transit. But it also may mean that these condos are significantly less affordable. Atlanta, in their Midtown area, did a bunch of this, and it's problematic. I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. Any development must address housing affordability in order to maintain a diverse neighborhood if you're interested in trying to preserve queer spaces, because middle-aged and older queer folks may have good jobs and may have good incomes, but we know that there are also a lot of young queer folks who are completely priced out of a lot of these places. And so we have to be extremely careful to make sure that any changes to a neighborhood are also going to have affordable housing. Next slide, please. There's some pretty significant zoning impacts on adult enterprises. Often rezoning is used to exclude existing adult enterprises to make areas quote unquote safe for families. Well, which families? I'm in a family. My wife and I consider ourselves a family. When my children from a previous marriage lived with us, we were clearly a family. Um, but not the kind of family that some of these proposals target. Again, going back to the Atlanta case, Cheshire Bridge Road in Atlanta was an area a mile or so from the Midtown dense concentration of gay men, primarily. And there were some seedy bars, there were some strip clubs, there were some um, uh, uh, porn shops, some video shops, and some automobile repair shops, and some restaurants and stuff like that. This was deemed to be not conducive to family development. So they created a task force. They're going to make the corridor safe for mixed land uses that are only family friendly. On that private sector, they proposed new zoning down at the bottom, NC5, and adjacent to it, NC4. And they tried to ban all of the adult enterprises in that. Unfortunately, when I looked at the list of that material, I saw that along in the list of adult enterprises were all the gay bars along that strip, and there were 5 or 6 gay bars as well. Now, gay bars are not typically considered adult enterprises, but depending on who's writing these zoning codes, they could be, and that could have a very adverse effect. Next slide, please, Nathan. So there was a lot of neighborhood pushback in this. A business manager of a gay bar said, "I'm concerned that all these changes will have an effect on the gay-friendly nature of this strip. It may be family-friendly, it may be no longer gay-friendly." And a wonderful gay reporter writing in the Georgia Voice, which is the free LGBT paper, said, "So do we allow the Jungle, a gay bar, the Heretic, to go the same way as Backstreet? We'll talk about Backstreet in just a minute. Do we allow another community to be yuppified, buppified, and sterilized, forcing us, the gays who wish to party, to some industrial area on the outskirts of the city?" Next slide, please. So there was pushback in the press and others. The community came out and protested, and they were able to, quote unquote, save Cheshire Bridge from these onerous adult NC5 ordinances. So some of the questions that come in there is, who gets to define what's an adult business? Is it a gay bookstore that might have some porno? Well, the way we're banning books these days from schools and other things, there's a lot of things that I wouldn't consider porno that might be considered porno. And if that's included in a gay bookstore, then does that become an adult enterprise? A gay video store. Well, lots of videos. You could when there were video stores widely available, Blockbuster and all. Oh no, I'm dating myself because we don't do that anymore. There aren't any Blockbusters left, but there are still gay video stores, often with a back room or some stalls in the back where things happen that mom and pop might not be as comfortable with. Gay bars are also just bars, but sometimes they have a back room and sometimes things happen in those back rooms. Are these activities adult enterprises or are they not? I mean, you can't get into a bar if you're below underage, so it should be safe. What about gay clubs for non-traditional clientele, whether it's some kind of B&D or leather or whatever the next generation decides is their particular kink? These things also could have been included in that. A reflection for, I'm sorry, I'm going to take a sip of water. One reflection on a sort of a backdoor tool for preservation is the assumption that as we clean up a neighborhood, perhaps we want to get rid of all these noisy, seedy bars. Well, noisy, seedy bars may be very important in defining a neighborhood. And if you are a straight family, maybe you don't want to move in next door to a gay bar that plays loud music and has a lot of um, young and queer-looking people on the streets in the afternoon and evening. So, in fact, working as planners, sort of in the guerrilla bureaucracy, as I was saying before, to try to ensure that gay bars are preserved, may in fact enable the areas around those bars to also be preserved from excessive gentrification. That's a supposition on my part, but it's a wondering because we tend to think, well, let's clean everything up, make it look nice, make it look pretty. And if that means getting rid of the gay bars, that becomes a huge problem. Next slide, please. So the other piece of this that I want to talk about, again, drawing on an example from Atlanta, fast track development zones. Sometimes cities are very concerned with sort of increasing the development of a particular area, fast tracking it so we can make it safe for investors to come in and spend a lot of money and clean things up. Um, and so zoning is sometimes used to reduce neighborhood input into that approval process. In Atlanta, they created the Atlanta codes allow for special public interest zoning, where you sort of create a zone and then what happens within that is determined not by the surrounding community, but by the municipality. And that special public interest zoning was used. You can't see that the map because it's too small in the bottom. But if you see the green on the right, just below that is the heart of Midtown, and just adjacent to it, in fact, where there were a number of gay bars. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, wonderful. Thanks, Nathan. So this dense area, well,
Sorry about
that's okay.
that.
The density, I mean, so anyway, what they did is they made this a fast track area so that they could have upzoning to encourage condo development and large scale investors. They prioritized through in this area big box stores that had an adverse effect on mom and pop stores, including small LGBT relevant businesses, bookstores, and the like. So what happened is you had the development community was pushing, we want to develop the Peachtree Street corridor, which is just adjacent to Midtown, but that's also where many, not all, but some of the gay bars were that really struggled. And the number of gay bars in Atlanta has dropped precipitously. There are still gay bars. Midtown still exists, but for how much longer? Okay, next slide, please. Yep. Okay. So a little more on Midtown. They had this Peachtree development plan to develop this. This is part of what that SPI zoning was for. They envisioned Peachtree as the Champs-Élysées, the Magnificent Mile, a Fifth Avenue with a Southern twist. And the whole goal of this entire project was to make Midtown safe for families. Well, yes, the area was a little seedy in the 60s and 70s. There had been, there was a lot of street life, kids hanging out. They say there were some drugs that were being peddled on the streets, and certainly there was prostitution, and all these things made it kind of seedy. So they wanted to clean it up, i.e., clean up the riffraff, get rid of the hippies, the homeless street people, the drug users. Oh, and by the way, the trans people as well. And so that's what they did. Next slide, please. One of the ways that they did that was they created a private security force, Midtown Ponce Security Association. They put um, uh, cameras on a lot of street corners, and then they began to pressure the bars and trying to close them. Because obviously, if you got rid of all these seedy bars and other areas, then all the property values in the neighborhood would go up and everybody would be happy, right? Not necessarily. Next slide, please. We'll go on and talk about um, a variety of So again, so what you have here are sort of two sides. Ordinance enforcement is not technically planning, is not technically zoning, but it all is. These are tools that cities use to create change, urban change. Noise ordinances are often applied to, excuse me, control raucous gay bars. Now, well, not nobody, but most people don't want to live right next to a loud gay bar or with that thumping beat going on until however late the bars close. In Atlanta, for a while, there were 24-hour clubs, so it would go on all night. Nobody wants to live next to that. Oh, unless you're going to the gay bar and you come out stumbling and you only have to go, 50 feet to where your apartment is. That would be a good co-location. But that doesn't necessarily happen because um, we'll come to that in a minute. Licensing enforcement. They began policing gay clubs with a sort of a fine-tooth comb with a magnifying glass, making sure there were no errors. And I'll talk about the Backstreet case in a moment. Nuisance or loitering enforcement happens across the country. Crackdowns on queer youth hanging out on the Christopher Street piers, for instance, in New York City, or queer youth of color who have no other place in their neighborhoods to hang out were descending upon Chicago's Boys Town and creating a problem for somebody. And so it was felt that they needed to crack down, except where are these young queer folks going to go if the public spaces in which they could be, and Chicago's Boys Town is marked with pylons, it's, pretty clearly queer. Why can't they go out on that street? Well, obviously, some people felt that it was unsafe to have these gangs of young kids, queer kids running around. Also, targeted narcotics enforcement, um, targeting particularly patrons of gay bars. There was a classic case of the Eagle, which was a leather bar on Ponce de Leon in Atlanta. The police chief decided he was going to do targeted enforcement because there could be drugs there, and they dragged all the patrons out, spread eagled them on the pavement, and checked them all for drugs. I don't think they found much. The bar owner sued and did win an excessive enforcement ban, a fine from the police department. So the case went to court, and the bar won. That they had no reason for checking it except the fact that it was a leather bar. So I think the Eagle is, well, no, I take that back. It's been a few years. There was some contention about whether it was going to close. It survived, but I think I read something that it might have closed recently. I'm not in Atlanta, so I don't know.
Dr.
Uh,
Doan, I live here, so it moved
it
locations.
moved.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Nathan. Yep, it's gone. Next slide. Cracking down on sex work. This happens in lots of cities. urban improvement schemes tend to target non-normatively gendered sex workers. Edelman has written about prostitution-free zones in Washington, D.C., which are crackdown zones for trans sex workers of color. In Toronto, in the Church and Wellesley neighborhood, um, there were gay gentrifiers who were clashing with trans sex workers. In this case, it was gay folks living in these nice houses who wanted to get rid of the trans sex workers who live nearby. And in Atlanta, the Midtown Ponce Security Alliance um, had a car, and they hired a guy to go out with a video camera and take pictures of cross-dressing prostitutes. Again, Atlanta's a lovely city, but there aren't a lot of places downtown where one could go out and work and engage in sex work. And if you are a trans sex worker, they called them cross-dressing prostitutes. Um, Going to the edge, the outer edges of Midtown were places where they would go. And so one of the ways that they would crack down on these people is go out by this guy. He'd take pictures of people out on the streets, and then he'd post them publicly online. And then they'd pass this on to the police and say, "We please come arrest these people." It seems targeted enforcement, trying to clean up the city, but what you're doing is making it less possible for queer folks to survive. Next slide, please. So an example of the targeted licensing enforcement, Backstreet was a four-story gay bar that had, I think, four different dance floors. It was in the 90s, it was a thing to be seen. On the top floor was Charlie Brown's Cabaret, which was a wonderful drag show. But it was a 24-hour club. In that day, it was possible for you to be a 24-hour club. It was members only. You had to pay a small cover charge to buy a membership at the door, and then you could stay there all night. I went several times. I never made it all night. But there were lots of complaints about noise, trash in the streets, people coming out, leaving cups lying around, and just generally sort of undesirable people moving around the streets of this, where Backstreet was located on Peachtree Street. Um, and that was problematic. So actually the head of the Midtown Ponce Security Association lived in a set of condos that had been built behind Backstreet, and she was the one who was pushing very hard at the city level to do some targeted enforcement. The city responded. They did a strict review of licensing and memberships. Backstreet lost its license as a nightclub. They tried to get a license as a dance-only club with no liquor. That didn't work either. They gave up and sold out. And in its place is this Viewpoint condominium, which is, I don't remember the number of stories. It looks like it's about 25-story building, lots of condos. And if you've got the cash to live in one of those, it's great. But if you are a young gay person coming in from somewhere in rural Georgia or Alabama, coming to Atlanta to try to make ends meet, it's not going to meet your housing needs. Next slide, please. So what's the role for planning? Clearly, we need to provide support to diverse LGBTQ needs. Ensuring affordable housing is critical. HIV/AIDS support across ethnic communities. In Toronto, they've found that in order to provide HIV/AIDS support, it's really important for Toronto has a large Asian community, and it's important to have Asian-specific AIDS support organizations, and they do that. African American specific AIDS support communities and the like, depending on how a particular community is set up, with different communities' comfort with different types of people. Different ethnic groups may not feel as comfortable going to a site that is focused on white gay men, for instance. We also need to think about both our youth and our elders, because these are two populations that are not well served, as well as immigrants. Oh, well, we don't have to worry about immigrants anymore because they're all being, beaten up and taken away by ICE. That's not a good thing by any means. It's a horrific part of the erasure that's happening. And I don't know how many of the people who've been picked up by ICE are also queer, but I know there are a lot of people who have applied for asylum based on their LGBTQ identity, and they are dependent on services from these community centers, these community areas as well. One of the things that's important is to think about how do we recognize an LGBTQ presence and invite LGBTQ organizations, such as they are, to be partners in planning neighborhoods. Next slide, and we'll go to Ybor City in Florida. So there is Ybor City is a historic Latin area in just outside of downtown Tampa. Um, It has an historic landmark status because there are some old cigar rolling factories that are there. And that has ensured that some of its Latin character is preserved. Unfortunately, some of its character is also Afro-Latino, Cubans of African descent, and those areas were divided by the urban redevelopment that happened in Tampa in the 60s. Um, Gay folks have been there since the 1970s, and some of them got together and created the Gaybor Coalition, the Gaybor District Coalition. And what they were able to do is partner with the Ybor City Development Corporation. This is sort of like that Midtown Development Association. But in this case, because Gaybor was active and they were able to partner, they worked together to ensure to create a coalition and to strengthen both operations together, so that the Ybor City Development Corporation actually has a seat on its board that is taken by a Gaybor District Coalition member, so that the gay community can have input into whatever changes are happening in Ybor City. This is a model that I have not seen replicated widely in other LGBTQ areas, but I think it's one that deserves really careful looking at. Next slide, please. So maintaining existing LGBTQ spaces. Rainbows are obviously a very popular marker, whether it's the Philly neighborhood on 13th Street with rainbow markings, the pylons on North Halsted Street, in marking Boys Town in Chicago, or that is the rainbow crosswalk in the Castro. I don't know if the Castro's rainbow crosswalk has been painted over yet. In Florida, they were eager to do it. In Texas, I gather they've been eager to do it. I don't know whether they have dared paint over the rainbow crosswalks in the Castro. Bars are clearly focal points at the core of the neighborhood. I, at this point, don't drink, and so bars are not part of my scene, but I recognize one of the people when I was doing work in Ybor City talked about bars as these are our living rooms. These are places where we gather to see our friends. And so they are important social focal points in the neighborhood for social gatherings. LGBT community centers, as I've said before, are critical to providing services to people both within the neighborhood, but also outside, because people come from all over the city because they know that they can get services there. And finally, one of the things I'd like to talk briefly about is sort of recognizing LGBTQ historical areas. There is some movement within the historic preservation community to recognize LGBTQ spaces. As I said, I was part of the task force that the Department of Interior called to to at least identify queer spaces, and to get them on the National Register of Historic Places. But to do that, you had to have a document that documents these things. And so that's what our task force was doing, was documenting the importance of LGBTQ history, and that's the document that's been taken down. Because when you go to try to say, this is the it ain't going to happen, but I'll use it as an example. This is the house that Petra Doan lived in Tallahassee when I become a, um, all right, so there's a quiz here. Um, we have a book and
Sorry
it's,
about that. I didn't mean for it to interrupt your talk. I was going to talk about it in just a minute, but please
that's
keep
fine.
going. We can talk about it after.
Okay. So anyway, if my house wants to be designated as a historic preservation property, you've got to document it. So you've got to refer to documents, official documents about why this is important. And we did this. There was at the same time there was a Latino historic preservation task force. There was an African American task force, and there was an LGBTQ task force. These are kinds of communities that are not well represented. Most of the historic preservation properties are properties of wealthy white folks. So they were trying to make this more inclusive. Next slide, please. So just a couple more. I've got that on my screen. Nathan, can we make that go away? Maybe it's not on other people's screen, but it is on mine. The giveaway of Dr. Doan's book entry. Maybe if I click on it, it'll go away. There we go. Okay. So how do we consider queer space and trans folks? Well, in my experience coming out as trans in the late 90s, gay villages were vital for coming out. They were places we could go to test the waters, if you will. And I imagine that's still the case, or at least was for a while, and maybe then you could go anywhere you wanted. But I wonder in this age when transgender has become a nasty word again, and we are accused of being a violent reactionary extremists. The FBI is thinking about having transgender-inspired violent extremists. So anybody who's trans is likely to be labeled a transgender-inspired violent extremist, TIVE. So we may need places to go again where we can be safe as we're sort of trying to figure out our identities. Locus for community services. Community services, I've said it over and over again, are critical. In an era where many hospitals are shutting down their gender affirming care, access to hormones, access to all variety of testing, access to mental health services, these kinds of services are critical for the trans population. And so, again, ensuring that these community centers, neighborhood health clinics can continue to survive and thrive is really important because they are under a dual threat from gentrification and current politics, and they will have huge impacts on the trans community. And so planners need to be aware of that. Next slide, please. Just two more, I think. There is a complicated trans subjectivity. There's intersectionality within the trans population. Most of the sex workers who get in trouble happen to be, gee, well, I wonder why, trans women of color, because that's how targeted enforcement works. But income makes a huge difference. Race makes a difference. Ethnicity makes a difference. The 2008 National Transgender Discrimination Survey. I'm sorry to use an old survey, but we're not doing these kinds of large scale surveys at this point. There were 6,500 people who filled it out. 13% of them responded and said my gender wasn't listed. They listed transgender, man and woman, but they didn't list anything beyond that. And all of you know, I'm sure, that there's this thing called gender nonconformity, non-binary gender. And boy, did people who did this survey just 17 years ago find out, because people responded when they said, what is your gender if it's not listed? And I think the creativity, the sense of self is wonderful. Some of the names are Twidget, Burl, genderqueer, pangender, hybrid, two-spirit, mahuane, and aggressive are just a few examples. Next slide, please. But what was also important is that, okay, so what are some of the solutions to trans exclusion? Gender inclusive non-discrimination ordinance continue to be really important. One of the critical pieces is protection for public accommodations, especially for restrooms and toilets. Employment protections as well. Training public officials on gender nonconformity, court officers, police, TSA, transit police, ICE. Um, uh, I don't know that any of that is happening today, but to the extent that we can protect these kinds of trainings, this is not necessarily DEI training. It's simply training people to understand who they might be dealing with. Um, one of the ways in which this has been done, and I just want to hold it up as again another shining example, is to create what Harrison Higgins and I talked about in one of our earlier articles about the possibility for cultural overlay districts to preserve presence in existing queer spaces. San Francisco has a a Chinatown Historic Preservation District, which is a cultural overlay district over Chinatown. We were suggesting that they might think about that for LGBTQ spaces. And in fact, they did. Next slide, please. They created the transgender district about 10 years ago in the San Francisco's Tenderloin district. This is the area around Compton's cafeteria. I'm sorry. Where there was a riot in 1966, which it has now been shifted to be. We think about Stonewall as being the first gay riot, but in fact there was a trans riot at Compton's cafeteria in 1966. Because that area of the Tenderloin has been a high concentration area with low income trans people, because there is some affordable housing in some single room occupancy hotels that still exists there. And so one of the goals of this transgender district is to stabilize that transgender housing, to keep those SROs in operation, and then to have some training for economic empowerment, to create some entrepreneur incubators, increasing participation of the trans community in shaping protective city regulations and programs promoting safe spaces. And at the bottom, providing access, ensuring there is access to public restrooms. So this becomes, I think, a really useful example if other places have the ability to pass it through city council or whatever the local municipal form of government is. But it's an excellent example. And maybe one more slide. Finally, a few more solutions. Creating welcoming solution places for non-normative youth. Trans-inclusive healthcare, particularly for youth, is critical. Drop-in centers for queer youth, targeted programs, housing support. San Francisco has this lyric, the Lavender Youth Resource Information Center. Every neighborhood should have a youth drop-in center that provides resources because there's a huge problem of homeless gay youth. One of the reasons there are an awful lot of trans sex workers, not an awful lot, but there are trans sex workers, is can't find a job. If you're trans and or visibly a non-binary, sometimes it's hard to find work. So how can you provide services? How can you provide some basic training, how to locate friendly employment, and how to do generally advocacy for trans and gender nonconforming youth? I think that's my last slide.
It is, and thank you so much, Dr. Doan. This has been a great presentation. And thank you everybody for tuning in today. We are out of time, but we do have only have about a couple minutes left. And I just want to be respectful of people's time today. So real quick, I want to plug the fact that we are giving away a copy of Planning in LGBTQ Communities, which is written by Dr. Doan. So if you haven't already, it looks like about 56 people have filled out the poll. And I apologize for pushing that out in the middle of the presentation. I didn't realize it would pop up on people's screens like that. But please do so. Please fill that out. We'll choose a single person to mail a copy of that out to. And if there are any issues, we have your email and cell number as well. Then I want to run through a few quick audience questions. I had some questions prepared, but I want to use the remainder time to really hear from y'all. So we have a couple questions in the chat. Tatiana asked, zoning was discussed, but what about HOAs with deed restricted covenants?
Yeah, so I'm not an expert on homeowner associations and how those restrictive covenants could define families in particular ways. That is certainly possible. Um, but yes, so Tatiana, that's a great question. But one that would be well worth investigating. I have not looked at it, but there might be an excellent paper or a short report for how these things can be restrictive. We know that restrictive covenants have been applied against people of color. Are they being applied against non-traditional families? Are they being applied against two men, two women moving in together, two trans people moving in together? I don't know. I suspect they have. And so that would be well worth investigating.
And then Cody asked for any book recommendations. I will work with you, Dr. Doan, on compiling a list of book recommendations, and then
Oh,
we can
sure.
send it out to the audience list,
Sure.
um, just to make best use of our time. Britta said, what are your thoughts on informal DIY and ephemeral trans and queer community spaces that operate under the radar of official planning bureaucracy? For example, parties on empty lots, house parties spread by word of mouth, and burlesque shows at anarchist slash punk venues. Do you think these kind of temporary queer spaces are better equipped to survive the current trends of dispossession and surveillance?
Absolutely. When there is surveillance happening, when there's surveillance happening, you do what you can. You gather where you can. House parties have been popular for a long time and sort of informal ways of telling people where we're going to gather. One example that I know is the lesbian potluck is a great way that lesbians build community, and it's completely under the radar. Now, as for pop-ups in empty lots, sure, that's another way to do it. It's kind of like uh, oh, I'm just blanking on the phrase for it. The pop-up street art that sort of creates a bump out on the middle of in a parking space and creates a little pop-up park. Often these are done. Um, uh, I think they're called insurgent spaces. So insurgency is a great way to make these kinds of spaces happen. It takes a lot of work. There is risk. And so are there ways in which spaces can be made available, um, larger spaces where people can gather, where they don't have to worry about being um, arrested, fined, or otherwise harassed by the police? Are there public venues, public facilities that could be used for these sorts of things? Again, this is why gorillas in the bureaucracy is important. I think you in each of your cities probably need to be sort of aware and tuned in to the needs of these populations to gather. Everybody needs to be able to gather in this day and age, even more important. But yes, doing it under the radar, as it were, is probably critical.
Thank you. There was a question about a report that was mentioned on the importance of LGBTQ spaces. Liv would like to have the reference to that, and I think if we could include that in that list of
Yep.
books, then we'll send that out
I
to
think that was the task force for historic preservation of LGBTQ spaces. I think that I'll put that on for sure.
okay. Then there was let me make sure I didn't miss anything. There was a question from Justin. How does HUD, housing and of urban development, define household unit versus family currently? And is HUD's definition affirming?
I'm going to have to say I'm not up on what the current definition is. Um, I suspect in this era, in this political era, it's not going to be very affirming. But I can't answer that question. It's an excellent question. And again, I would encourage people to go look at HUD's definition. I intend to when this is over, because that's an excellent question. But it's really what's important at the local level. But If the Department of Housing and Urban Development, they do try to create standards and they hope people will model, but whether it's been modeled at and in um, local regulations is not clear. But it's a great question. I can't answer it.
The next question is from Gabriella. Um, Never mind. That is one. Gabriella, we will actually send out that recording. So the next question for Dr. Doan is, do you think providing gender identity on job applications is harmful or helpful for being hired?
Well, Martine Rothblatt wrote a great piece, 25, 30 years ago, in which she argued the title of the book was The Apartheid of Sex. Why do we ask our sex designation on passports, for instance? I understand the Trump administration is now going to retroactively take away my passport. Um, why do they need to know? Because of my gender. Why do they need to know that? Why do you need to know that on a job application? I think it's ridiculous. I don't think gender is something that's required on a job application. I don't think it's required on a driver's license. Why are we so obsessively concerned with checking people's gender? And in terms of trans people in sports, why do we think that checking everybody's genitalia to make sure that they can play on a team isn't going to result in horrific experiences for young people, whether or not they're trans, when they are asked to pull down their pants in front of some school administrator? I think this is a nightmare scenario, and I think we really need to dial that back. And I'm not talking about whether trans kids should or shouldn't. I'm just saying the enforcement is likely to create such a horrific shitstorm of potential for, just horrific abuse and potential sexual violence. I just can't even imagine why you'd think about wanting to do that, no matter where you fall on the decision about whether it's right for trans folks to participate in sports. And I'm not answering that question explicitly.
Well, there is one, there are a couple more. From Mar, thank you so much for the presentation. I've read a lot of your work to inform my graduate thesis on queer neighborhoods. I live in Seattle, and they have currently passed legislation allowing and encouraging co-living units and dormitory style affordable housing. Are there any concerns you have with this, or is this a possible successful form of advocating for affordable housing for poly and queer communities?
I don't know the Seattle code, but it sounds potentially very positive. Allowing people to sort of be together in sort of group housing is a key for affordable housing. You know, in Atlanta, or out in Decatur anyway, they were trying to allow mother-in-law units to be added to increase of more affordable housing, and I think that's important. But this is doing it on a much larger scale, and I'm sure this is well, I don't know where it is in Seattle, but I know the Capitol Hill, which was the old gay space. Property values are going up pretty high in that area. When I went through there, I think when APA had its national conference in Seattle, that was probably 10 years ago at least. Um, just Capitol Hill is changing. And so when property values go up, you've got to provide affordable housing. But the devil is in the details. And so you, as planners listening to this, you have to be sensitive to how might this impact? Is it a poly community? Is it the next iteration of the Atlanta Feminist Alliance? We're not going back to the 1970s. We are in the 2020s. And we are in a situation where we may need to get together in group housing and organize, because that's how we have to operate in this day and age and it could get worse. I keep praying that it's gotten as bad as it's going to get, but I don't think that's the case. And so we have to organize, and that may involve folks coming together and doing that kind of work.
And then we have a couple more minutes. So we have three questions currently in the chat. Liz asked, do you know of any examples when LGBTQ communities have worked with communities of color in addressing gentrification?
Um, Again, a really good question. So when the LGBT community, I'm rephrasing that question, when the LGBT community worked with a community of color to address gentrification. Well, in Atlanta, as Midtown got very pricey, what happened is gays began moving out and lesbians as well to places like East Atlanta, out to oh, what's the place over near the airport? Um, it's on the Metro line, about two stops before the airport. Sorry, Nathan, the name's gone out of my head. But anyway,
College
there are
Park,
a number. Pardon me.
East Point or College Park?
East Point. It's
Okay.
East Point. Thank you. Ding. What happens when you turn 70, right? Stuff isn't there as quickly as you want it. East Point. I spent some time in East Point talking with people, and what you had were very clearly LGBT folks living right next to, well, I have some friends who moved in right next door, and there were people dealing drugs in the next house over. And what they did as a street is they got together. There were other queer folks on the street, other people of color on the street, and at a street level, they organized to talk about how are we going to deal with this? Because the some of the people of color were no happier about the drug dealers on the street than the LGBT people were, and they found that by talking to each other, creating a neighborhood, um, small neighborhood uh, discussion space that they could build solidarity around that. And eventually, the drug dealers. I think there was a raid, and the drug dealers moved out. I don't think they were turned in by the neighborhood, but the neighborhood was, it took some talking. Is it happening on an organizational level, which is, I think, Liz's question? I don't know that it's happening via organization, but as more and more in Atlanta, as more and more queer folks can't live in downtown Atlanta and are moving out to places like East Atlanta, East Point, and other areas out south of Decatur. Um, there, these communities are coming together, and so and overlapping, um, and um, work needs to be done to ensure that people are talking to each other. That's, I think, what I found when I did some interviews in Atlanta. People who talk to their neighbors and engage with their neighbors at an individual level is almost where that important work needs to happen. Um, is it happening on an organizational scale? I didn't see it, but it would be a good thing to sort of work on. I know there was a mayor's task force in Atlanta on LGBT issues, and there may have been some discussion at that point. I don't know whether that task force is still in operation, but I had a doctoral student who looked at that and looked at some of those issues. Atlanta's got some um, wonderfully queer, wonderfully organized young folks working on a variety of these sorts of issues. So some of them may be working on that, but I don't know about other cities as well.
It is active. The mayor's been very active with that task force or whatever the name of it is now.
It's
But
some advisory committee of some kind.
right. So I do apologize to Liv and Hayden. We are out of time. But I just wanted to again thank Dr. Doan for her time today, and everybody who tuned in today for their participation and listening in. This recording will be sent out in the next couple of days, likely next week, just because today is Friday, to everybody on our mailing list, and I believe everybody who signed up on Eventbrite, who submitted their email addresses. So if you know of anybody that wasn't able to attend today, please do share that with them, and please do make sure to get credit from your APA account if you are pursuing or have AICP. If there are any questions, you're welcome to reach out to LGBTQ planning I believe that's our email. Let me make sure. To the division. We always do welcome new members and new members especially um, to the programs committee, which I am the chair of. So it is LGBTQ planning at gmail.com, and we certainly welcome that. But thanks again, everybody. That concludes today's webinar, and I hope you all have a nice weekend.